To make a change is to cross borders. Some borders are between countries, continents, and times. Others are in our minds, defined by our past, habits, or simply the society that we live in. With a ticket in his pocket and lots of new ideas, David Zilber was ready to cross them all, leaving his comfort zone and discovering something new. The winter before the young cook had sent his application to Noma, a high-end restaurant known for its creative cuisine and fine flavours, he had saved enough money to be able to afford the leap overseas, out of Canada, his home country. It frightened him to leave his entire support group behind, but he was confident that he could make it. Little did he know that this would be a step on his new path, where he would combine his passion for science and the arts with his talent for cooking and bring about a change in the way we think and eat. Game Changer, an audio series about innovative changemakers. Today's game changer is David Zilber. He is a professional chef, fermenter, food scientist, and author hailing from Toronto, Canada. He has worked in some of the world's top kitchens since 2004, most notably serving as the director of the world-renowned fermentation lab at restaurant Noma, where he employed fungi and bacteria to transform foodstuffs into bold new ingredients. His joy for sharing knowledge has led him to teach and lecture at the likes of Harvard, Cambridge and Stanford, and the University for Gastronomic Sciences. David currently works in Copenhagen as a food scientist on the frontiers of flavour and innovation. Hello and welcome, David.
Hi, Charlie. Thank you. Thanks for having me.
You're most welcome. It's a pleasure to have you on. I've got to admit, I'm very excited. I'm going to confess that I'm a bit of a fan of fermentation and mycology. I've been watching a lot of programs about this on Netflix, and my girlfriend actually brews her own kombucha too. So we have our own little science project going on in the kitchen at home.
That's great.
So many things I want to ask you. I guess I'm just going to dive in. You're using the help of microbes to build a fairer and more sustainable food system. Now, for someone who is unfamiliar with your work, it must seem quite strange to use microorganisms as tiny as microbes for such large purposes. How does this even work? Where did this all come from?
We can't forget that all life on Earth, when it first arose out of nothing but the raw chemistry and geology of this early planet 4.5 billion years ago, all life on Earth was microbial. And the forms of life that we have come to associate with the natural world, trees and antelopes and bears and lions and elephants and blue whales, anything you can see with the naked eye depends on that microbial life still to be able to live. All multicellular life is an offshoot of the microbial kingdom, out of these single-celled organisms that, float through the air on motes of dust or swim in our tap water and oceans and lakes. So it's kind of natural when you think about it in that way that, well, if these microbes have been here the whole time and if they've never gone away, that they're still folded into all of these living processes, and they absolutely are. They live inside of us. They're the reason we have to brush our teeth. They're the reason we get upset stomachs sometimes or feel great when we exercise or eat delicious and healthy foods. And, in your introduction, you talked about boundaries and borders. I can't stress enough, and this will probably come up a lot in our conversation, that the idea of you as a discrete human individual, or me, defined by the border of our skin and our face and our hands, that's a very fuzzy boundary. And turns out, and this science is only about, maybe like 150, 170 years old now, that the boundaries between what happens inside of us, what happens in our food, it's almost non-existent. So these microbes that live in the fields of wheat that we sow, that live on, the teats of cows whose milk we farm, who live on our cabbages and our oranges and our lemons and our meat, they're constantly in the process of transforming those foods, whether they're on our plates, whether they're in our refrigerators, whether they're in the process of being turned into prosciutto, whether they're inside of us being digested. And humanity has learned how to, I wouldn't necessarily say harness, but maybe guide some of those processes to ends that we find both useful and delicious. And that little intersection there is the process of fermentation. That's the process of transforming food with the help of microbes to make them more delicious, more nutritious, and to make them last. But it really, truly is this kind of fascinating meeting point or nexus between, when you start digging into it, the history of life on this planet and the way that organisms live symbiotically together.
Yeah, that's a pretty expansive way of looking at it. I guess, most people think about the food they see in their fridge, the food they see in their supermarket. They don't necessarily think about things on this kind of micro level. And to have the insight that you have must be very interesting in terms of the ways you look at food and the world around you.
Yeah, but it's funny because you got to go small to go big. And at first you're like, oh, hey, maybe I could look up a recipe for making yogurt at home. Something that seems so simple, right? And when you really start digging into it and you're like, wait, where did this bacteria come from? Or it's like, wait, this bacteria lives in my mouth too, and it lives on the cow's skin, and it's just there, and then it works magically to produce this food I love. How does that work? When you shrink down and start to understand those kind of machinations, sure, you talked about the micro, but it goes real macro, real fast. And you're like, oh, this touches everything. And that's what I think is one of the most fascinating parts about fermentation. When you start to learn about it, it just blows open your entire conception of how the world fits together.
I mean, this is like, I guess my very simplistic layman's understanding is, the kombucha that we've got in our kitchen, which is, I never previously considered, what a sort of big lump of yeast or this kind of living organism that goes in this glass jar that my partner puts all the tea and the sugar into, and then it uses the sugar, and it's like a living organism in our kitchen. I mean, I'll be sitting there typing away on my laptop, and this thing's like bubbling and almost breathing, and it's
talking to you.
Yeah, and it is like a living thing that makes this delicious sort of fizzy fermented drink that we drink, for our guts and everything, and for helping our microbiome. And
also, I hope you drink it because it tastes good. Like, I hope that's the primary reason you're drinking kombucha. It shouldn't have to be something that you like struggle through. Like, it's pretty tasty medicine when you consider that. What flavor do you brew at home with your girlfriend, with your partner?
So it's been a bit trial and error, but yeah. So we tend to use green tea, and then she sometimes pours in a bit of apple juice.
Oh, that's delicious. That's a great combo.
I mean, she's nailed it. She's pretty good with it.
Lovely.
So yeah. I mean, this is it. When I knew that you were coming on the show, I just thought, wow, this is going to be a really, really insightful conversation. I've got to ask you as well, where did this all begin for you? Where was this from? Who are your role models? Who are the people that inspired you? There's got to be somewhere this all began for you. Was it as a kid at school? Was it later on? Tell me.
Well, looking back in the history of my life, and they say that hindsight is 20/20. I think my dad is a pretty inspiring figure in that he was like, I didn't necessarily think that growing up. Like, he was bad cop. My mom was good cop. My mom was like, oh, you got bad grades at school? Here, have a present. Let's go out for ice cream. But my dad would be the one to scold me, like he was kind of the enforcer of the two of them. But he was also, my mom was a school teacher. My dad was an engineer. He was an aircraft engineer. And he's a super nerdy guy himself. He definitely passed that on to me. And he's the one who instilled a love of sciences in me. Not just genetics. I mean, like taking me to the science museums and, factory visits and feeding me Carl Sagan at way too young an age. But it paid off. So He's definitely the person I credit with my curiosity and my inclination for wanting to understand things. You know, people often throw around the word science as like some sort of monolithic institution or, you know, a book that rivals the Bible if you could compile every paper and published article or whatever it might be. But science is just a way of going about being in the world. It's a process. It's a way of asking questions and finding the best possible, least wrong answers. And that's all it is. And so if you're a curious person and you're a rigorous person, odds are you will go through your life with a scientific inclination to understand how things fit together and to get results that you can trust until you can't anymore. You know, even though I ended up in the culinary arts, you know, something that has for a long time been considered not a scientific discipline, I'd always had a love of science. I'd you know, read books and papers and go on Wikipedia deep dives just in my spare time for the fun of it, even though not a lot of that learning had an output in the kitchen. But when I got to Noma, I'd finally arrived at a restaurant after cooking for, 10 or 12 years in Canada and the States. When I got to Noma, I'd finally arrived at a restaurant that rewarded that curiosity and had an outlet for scientific inquiry. And so if you could help to make the food there better through your knowledge or understanding of chemistry or even physics, for that matter, it's shown positively on you. And that's exactly what happened to me. You know, I was working on the barbecue section as a cook at the time, and I found a way to make the bone marrow main course better through my understanding of science and physics, and, you know, that people paid attention. And eventually I was moved into the fermentation lab, and that's where my deep dive that now lasted, 6-7 years into fermentation really begun wholesale.
And, you know, most people would think of a kitchen in a restaurant, but then this whole idea of a fermentation lab, can you just describe what that is? That like a laboratory? Is that a separate thing to where the cooking's happening? What's the kind of setup? What would that look like?
Yeah, absolutely. So Noma, the very fancy high-end restaurant, voted world's best restaurant, 5 times now over the course of its 20 years. You know, it has a kitchen to make the food. You go there, you get maybe 20 courses of food. There's a kitchen full of an army of chefs cooking for you. Every restaurant has a kitchen. Not every restaurant has a test kitchen where the chef can work and not get in the way of service and come up with ideas for the next menu or come up with specials. No restaurant I'd worked in before I got to Noma had a test kitchen. But you find fancy restaurants like 11 Madison Park in New York or Alinea in Chicago. They have a test kitchen where the chef can dedicate time to R&D. Noma had 2 test kitchens, one to actually design the menu, but one to just do long-term research to come up with ingredients or processes that would then feed into the test kitchen to design the menu. So there were like layers to the research and development at Restaurant Noma in a way that kind of parallels how the auto industry works. It's like, sure, there's like the actual sculpting lab where it's like, hey, we've got our model and we're working and we're building it out of clay, and this is what our next series of sports cars is going to look like. But then you have people like doing deep, deep research and like, what materials could we make a car out of 10 years from now? What new forms of you know, locomotion, people testing new ideas for batteries or tires or all of these things. And so you have those R&D laboratories that obviously feed into the innovation in the automotive industry. And here was a restaurant that kind of did the same thing with natural ingredients. And the funny thing is that fermentation was our kind of most successful exploration. So even though we explored lots of other aspects of food science, from distillation to centrifugation to, you know, flavor extraction, with carbon dioxide or other solvents, we were dubbed the fermentation lab because that was probably about 95% of what actually made it on the menu.
Can I ask you, what's the most, I don't know, kind of out there thing that you've ever fermented that would probably surprise people the most, that perhaps people wouldn't think of?
Definitely. There's 3. They're all animals. Swan was one. It was awful. It tasted like a swamp. Because, I mean, they eat like seagrass. The funny thing about the swan is that swans are like the national bird of Denmark, like the king's bird. And so you're not allowed to hunt them.
We have the same system in England, I think. they belong to the king now. Yeah, you can't
Yeah,
kill
they're
or eat a
royal
swan.
creatures. You can't kill swans. So this swan came from Sweden, which is just across the water. But we had to like smuggle swan into Denmark to cook with it, and it was awful. Tasted like a swamp. Would not try again. Number 2 was beaver tail, which actually wasn't that bad. Very fatty, but it was just also very musky. And then top number 1 awful thing I fermented was bear, which had come from like Russia and had like, it was very janky, like a hunter. And it was like wrapped in saran wrap, and you could tell that it had defrosted on the way, but then been refrozen. And I don't know how long it had been in the field before it got to us. And I tried to turn it into kind of like a fish sauce, like a garum out of bear. And it was just the wrongest flavor I'd ever created. And we never, ever touched it again. Surprisingly, most of the things I've ever tried in the vegetable kingdom, or like the kingdom of fungus, like nothing there had been so off-putting that you would like spit it out. But these 3 animals were not good to eat.
Never to be tested again.
Yeah.
And the best thing you fermented? Your favorite thing?
The best thing I fermented, it's a fungus. So I know that you're on a fungus kick right now, Charlie. And this is, you know, you mentioned Merlin Sheldrake a little while ago, and it's his favorite fungus too, but it's a species of Aspergillus, which is a mold that's related to like the black mold that would have been in apartment. If you're like going to like university and you had your like crappy dorm room, and you would complain to your landlord about the black mold in your bathroom giving you like respiratory problems. It's a cousin of that. Kind of like how dogs are cousins of wolves, right? Like if your landlord had a dog in the backyard and it was a golden retriever, you'd be like, oh, that's cute. I get like, you know, my downstairs neighbor has a fun puppy I can play with sometimes. If your landlord had a wolf in the backyard that growled at you every time you came home, you would fear for your life. Same relationship. So Aspergillus, the one that we eat, is a domesticated form of that black mold, or relative, really. And it is not poisonous, and it doesn't cause respiratory problems. And it, in fact, is extremely delicious. But it is a crop blight. Like this was a parasite that used to live in the fields of rice paddies in Southeast Asia and southern China, you know, thousands of years ago, and generally over the course of time. It was domesticated because it was really good at making rice sweet. It would actually start to like digest the rice when it grew on it. And so some intrepid explorer, culinarian, kept doing this. He was like, oh, my mice went moldy, but I don't want to throw it out. I'm hungry. Ooh, it tastes kind of good. I'm going to keep doing this. That's basically how everything in fermentation happened, to be honest. It's like something going wrong and then someone being like, well, it's not that wrong. I'm going to keep doing it. But, you know, now, after thousands of years of domestication and tinkering and trial and error across, you know, Korea and China and Japan and basically everywhere in Asia, we have thousands of strains of Aspergillus. There is one strain of Aspergillus, now that I've caught you up to speed on fungus, that is, it hails from the southern tip of Japan, from Okinawa, which is like the tropical, beautiful Pacific paradise of Japan. And there they make a really special distilled liquor using this fungus grown on rice. And its technical name is Aspergillus awamori variant luchuensis. Long name, Latin, sounds confusing. When this thing grows on grains, like the grains that you would cook yourself for dinner, if you're like making like a barley porridge or something, you cook barley on your stove. If you're like steaming rice, you inoculate those grains with these spores. You give it a warm and moist, kind of damp environment. 2 days later, you have this fluffy bed of rice that is incredibly sweet, like candy, but then tastes a little bit like opening a package of oyster mushrooms for the first time, like the most pleasant flavor of the forest, mixed with, no lie, grapefruit rind and green apple, like biting into a juicy green apple off the tree. It produces the most incredible flight of like volatile aromas, but then also it produces citric acid, like it makes the same acid you get out of lemons, and it creates it in situ out of the raw materials that you give it to eat. And it is one of the most impressive forms of transformation I have ever tried in my 20 years working with food. It's magical. It's like near magical. You take something as plain as white rice and you end up with like magical forest Fruit Loops at the end.
That's absolutely incredible. I mean, really, really quite mind-blowing. And to see and taste that must be... I want to know what it tastes like now. I'm fascinated in where this all began for you. You said, you grew up really, interested in this world of science that your father opened your eyes to. And you mentioned, this moment in Noma with the bone marrow. Would you say that's your first game-changing moment in life, or is it something that you can pin back a lot further down the line?
First game-changing moment? I mean, there's probably been a lot of game-changing moments in life for me. Even the guidance counselor who suggested I do a co-op program and do a practical last semester for my high school degree or high school diploma. Like, she definitely changed the course of my life. The cooks in my very first restaurant changed the course of my life. And I was lucky to get a good placement with great chefs who cared about growing me into a great chef. I credit a lot of people who've kind of guided me along my path and saw potential in me and steered me towards the next stepping stone. And they're countless. I mean, we all have them in our lives. People that egged us on when we thought we couldn't do it. People that saw us struggling and were either, supportive or detrimental to our continuation. And I'm not saying that it was always easy to take criticism, but, those people make us who we are. And hopefully we are those people for others in our lives as well. Oddly enough, and this person's never going to hear this, but there was like a blog I used to follow when I was like 19, 20 years old, in the days of Tumblr. I'm dating myself. Called You Might Find Yourself in It. He was a designer from San Francisco. And I just loved learning about, he was probably like 5, 10 years older than me. I just loved learning about culture from his vantage point. And the thing is, like, he was a clothing designer, or maybe he was a graphic designer. Hard to tell. But his just interests were so varied. And I thought that was so admirable and attractive. And like, he would post about like his work, and he's like, oh, hey, look at this like visual language I came up with for this company, or look at this thing I developed for Arc'teryx, or whatever it might be. But then like the next day he'd post about like, here's this beautiful scene from a Wong Kar-wai film that I love. And then the next day he would post about, he's like, here's a great book I'm reading. And it was one of those books where I'm like, okay, I got to pick this up, because this guy, just everything about his taste is just on point. And it was a book called Through the Language Class. And it was a book on language. And I'm a cook. I've got like 3 years of cooking experience, and I have no right reading a book on linguistics. But I do, and it completely changes my understanding of the world. And I'd liked the sciences before. Like I said, like I liked learning about the cosmos and learning about how planes can fly and all these things in my teens. But this was a book that fundamentally changed how I thought about life, about how things fit together, about my own understanding of my own mind. And it got me hungry in a way that I'd never been hungry before for answers to questions that I didn't know I wanted to ask. And the immediate follow-up to that book was another book about language called Globish, about the history of English. And then there was like a book on cosmology, and then a book on like anthropology. And I just kept reading. And it was like the start of a deluge, really. And now I'm literally out of space on my bookshelf with hundreds of books. And most of them are not cookbooks. I got a big shelf of cookbooks, but most of them are just books about how the world works. And that one book, or that one blog post, let's say, I would say is the biggest game-changing moment in the history of my life.
That's really interesting to hear, just how one little thing can set the whole trajectory that in some ways, you could say has led you to where you are now. What would you say, what is your definition of a game changer? Yeah,
well, to change the game, Buckminster Fuller, this like famous scientist, mathematician, had this kind of prophetic view of the future in the time he was alive. I don't know if this was like the 40s or 50s, where he said, and it was fairly idealistic and maybe a little bit naive, but he said, and I'm paraphrasing here, one day with the advent of society and civilization, it might come to pass that the invention of one person might change the lives of 10,000 and improve them to such ends that we no longer have to like toil and work. And those 10,000 can live off the ideas that this one person came up with and produced for the benefit of all like humankind. That to me is a game changer. It's like it's an individual has the ability to change the paradigm for countless others. Now, that has kind of happened, but kind of in like awful ways for the past, 70 years or so, and good ways too. But it's like there's good and bad. It's yin and yang, There's positive and negative game changers for better and worse. But that to me is the meaning of a game changer. Someone who comes along and affects the lives of whose work or original ideas affects the lives of countless others that they would never have had the ability to reach through like one-on-one contact.
Yeah, that's pretty far-reaching. It's a great definition as well. I like that. We live in a time when, with social media and television becoming, how many channels we have on streaming services now, like the amount of information out there, the amount of the ability to reach more and more people and to discover those people who, who like yourself are changing people's whole idea of what is possible with food. We live in exciting times. We've come to a part of the show called How Dare You? And I have a couple of quick fire questions lined up that I want to ask you, David.
Okay.
What was the last new thing that you tried?
That's a tricky question because, I try new things all the time, especially food.
I appreciate that. It's a difficult question.
But now I'm like, there's a caveat to this. It's like, what's the last new memorable thing you tried? Because I've got to remember what actually made an impression on me. Where have I been? Oh man, it's been a whirlwind. I feel like I was in Thailand last winter and I was doing like a guest chef dinner series in Phuket, and I definitely must have had something new there that blew my mind. I'm just trying to think about what it was. I definitely had bullfrog there. Oh, you know what it was? It's not bullfrog. That was something new.
What's bullfrog like?
It wasn't like fishy. It was kind of
meaty.
It kind of like chickeny, but like maybe a little bit more reptilian than chicken. Not in a bad way. People forget that chickens are reptiles too, but they are. No, the last memorable new thing that I tried that will stand out in my mind for a long time to come, were the eggs of horseshoe crabs. So those prehistoric looking, like blue-blooded beach crawl.
They crawl out of the sea. They're these, Yeah,
so their eggs are like bright yellow and they taste like saffron, if saffron was a flower harvested out of the ocean. It was really cool. So I had horseshoe crab eggs and I cooked with them and I made this sauce for like a little tostada with them. And it was delicious and it was really trippy. Really, really cool flavor. So yeah. That.
Great answer. I don't think anyone's going to top that. What is a new thing that you want to try, but you don't dare?
I don't dare? Ooh.
You must try...
I'll try anything once.
Pretty out there with food, right?
I'll try anything once.
Okay.
I've got this like obsession with the mammoth steppe in Asia that crosses like Kazakhstan and Tibet, and I don't know why this place on Earth that seems unremarkable, but you see photos of it, and like if you really like look into the geography of the place and like the biome, and it's just like one of the most beautiful places on Earth. It has so much history, but it's like so wild and just open. It's like agoraphobia on drugs. It's just like frightening how big and expansive it is. I would love to go like horseback riding on the mammoth steppe. That shouldn't seem like a scary new thing, but when I think about like what it would take to do that, I'm like, oof. Just in terms of the logistics of my own life, I'm like, when will I make time for that? And I feel like excuses we come up with for doing things that we're attracted to is kind of like being afraid a little bit. You're like, oh, I really want to do that, but is it feasible? I think that's a little bit us manifesting fear sometimes. or like the fear of possibility, or the fear of like being open to danger or excitement. But I will do it. I will do it one day. I would love to go visit the Mammoth Steppe and go horseback riding with like Tibetan natives and milk yaks and drink, you know, the original bulletproof coffee.
I think that should be a Netflix series.
That would be fine. Maybe Ewan McGregor already made it.
But I prefer to see you in it.
That's probably an episode of The Long Way Round.
I was going to say, you know, that was my follow-up question is, you know, what's stopping you from doing it? But I guess just probably the logistics and the busy schedule that you must have.
Logistics, you know, having an entrepreneur girlfriend and a 2-year-old at home. Yeah, it means I can't just like drop my hat on a moment's notice and hop on the Orient Express. It doesn't work that way anymore.
You might have a bit of explaining to do when you get home.
Yeah, exactly.
You've worked in a kitchen. We talked about it. You know, it's half cooking, half of it's experimentation for scientific purposes. That alone is going to change a lot of people's idea of what food actually is. What is food to you? I mean, you know, what does it mean to you? What kind of things do you tend to eat? What is food to you?
Noma is kind of famous for, at least in like the culinary community, for having also thrown, it's been like 5 or 6 times now, like a big food symposium called MAD, which sounds like crazy, but in Danish, you would pronounce it Mel. And if you can kind of trace the Old English to like Old Norse, Mel sounds like meal, and that's what it means, is food. For MAD 4, the year I started at Noma, the theme of this symposium was, what is cooking? And in the like preamble in the days leading up, Brene had this big powwow with all the cooks, and he was talking about, you know, all the people that were going to come speak and all the guests that were invited to come watch it. And he asked us the question, he's like, what is cooking? Kind of what you asked me here. And me being a smartass was like, I think it's the culmination of, you know, cultural and biological forms of nourishment that, you know, encompass everything that we can use in nature to nourish ourselves. And he's like, that might be the answer. But that is kind of how I think of it. It's like food is the part of the world that you make a part of you, but it's also so much more than that. It is cultural, it's biological, it's emotional, it's a lightning rod, it is a form of comfort, it can be a form of abuse. It is the one act that engages all 5 of the human senses. Maybe there's 2 acts that do that. But it really is the act of you being in the world. There is no organism on Earth that doesn't feed itself. Even if you're a plant, you have to work to find sunlight. And there's other things you're taking up for your environment to nourish yourself. Like microbes do it. The smallest protozoa do it. You know, we all do it. We all eat. It is kind of fundamental to like the underlying physico-biological properties of what it means to be alive. Like one thing you can't get around in that equation. And like scientists at NASA argue about what are the definitions of life when they have to go look for it out in the stars or on moons or something. And the one thing that comes up is like you need to take energy in from the environment. Like full stop. And that's what food is. It is one of the essential non-negotiables of being alive.
And at the same time, like you said, it reaches into culture, into so many strands and threads of our lives.
Yeah.
And then before you even consider the kind of biological, microscopic kind of elements to it, I mean, this field of study that you're in must have changed your view of the world quite considerably.
Yeah, it absolutely did. It absolutely did. And I'm very thankful for it. I feel pretty privileged to have been given the opportunity to investigate. But the thing is, I've gone and made like cheese with grandmas in tiny villages in southern Bulgaria, in the Balkans, you know. I've like pressed soy sauce with like Japanese grandfathers, you know, in Aichi prefecture. And every time I talk to someone for whom food or fermentation is this like generational act of generosity and love, you know, this thing that they've done as much as they've breathed in their lifetimes, you know, going to the kitchen every day, to make a new batch of yogurt and to hang it, or going to work at something that's been, a business of their grandparents and their great-grandparents and their great-great-grandparents. They all think about it in the same way as me, and that's kind of profound. Like, they're like, there's this beauty in the fact that you're dealing with, yes, the food that you're trying to make, but that there's this something else that you can't reach, and the fact that it can be different every time. The temperature outside and how humid it is in your kitchen or your factory, and, how much rain the fields received that season or the year before. And they all pay attention to all these minute details, and they can all perceive those changes on the back end, whether that's a finished soy sauce, or that's a finished dried, pressed cheese, or a batch of kimchi or sauerkraut or whatever it might be. Anyone who does it intimately knows how to listen to the variation that the microbes bring into the picture. And it's thrilling and exciting. And I got to do it for 5-6 years at one of the highest levels in the world of food. And I was, by punishment of death or losing my job, required to innovate in this field and learn all I could. And that was an incredibly amazing opportunity. And I still work in this field at a very high level, but on a very different side of it now in food industry. And it still continues to fascinate me.
What's your prediction for the next kind of game changer we might see in your field, do you think? Do you have any ideas?
There are a lot of people that are trying to use technology the game has already been changing. Like in the late 70s in the field of, genomics and, going back to Genentech in California, the first gene modification, the first genetically modified organism, which I think was also the first organism to ever be patented. That's been spilling into the world of food for the past, 50 years now. And it's not slowing down. And now there's this kind of revolution called fermentation 2.0, where people, with new technologies like CRISPR, that we've heard a lot about, won the Nobel Prize a few years ago, its discovery, these extremely precise ways to modify organisms. People are calling this fermentation 2.0, where we're using the organisms that we've been using for thousands of years to make bread, beer, wine, cheese, and we're making really precise changes to them to make things better or less bad for the environment in some ways. It's like a techno-capitalist solution. The game is changing. It's been changing. I think that anyone who's ever tried a Sour Patch Kid, the little Haribo candy or whatever it is, they didn't know that the microbe that produced the citric acid that burned their tongue was genetically modified. They didn't know that. They didn't know that that acid didn't come from lemons. But it's true. And it probably required a far smaller footprint than a lemon orchard to be able to do it. Or a lemon grove. I think if it's citrus, it's a grove. But if it's a palm, it's an orchard. Anyway. The game has been changing for some time now. But to be honest, the way I'd like the game to change, I would like to see less of that. I would like to see the food system go back to what the food system looked like 250 years ago. To be honest, I would like the food system to shrink and not be so globalized. Because the planet that got humanity here today, combined with human ingenuity, has been able to feed all of our ancestors. All of our ancestors are, by definition, the ones who had food to eat. They figured out how to work the land, how to hold on to the harvest, how to ferment, how to work with microbes, how to work with their natural environment. And they didn't have to trade commodity crops across several oceans several times over to produce something you can buy in a grocery store. So I think that, a return to that form of agriculture and food consumption would be better for humans and the planet.
I can appreciate what you're saying. I think whilst it's important to further our understanding of the world around us and science and push through boundaries, the boundaries that sometimes that hold us back, it's important to recognise where boundaries sometimes should stay and to not just keep moving forwards for the sake of moving forwards, perhaps. It's really...
You're absolutely right.
Yeah, it's very Very wise words. I guess just my final question, for people who are just interested in the whole process of breaking through barriers, what's your advice to someone who's in their career, who's trying to break forwards, who's trying to make that next step? You know, you have inevitably gone through some barriers to get to where you are today. How do you advise someone to do that?
It's funny, when I was in culinary school, when I was doing my co-op placement, you know, we had our cooking classes that were in like theaters basically, and you had a mirror to be able to see what the instructor was doing. And then like once or twice a week, you would have a big kind of theory class that was just you in like a lecture hall. And at this culinary school in Toronto, there was an absolute like dinosaur of a chef who was probably there on tenure by this point, but had like cooked in France during like the Nouvelle Cuisine Revolution in like the 60s and worked alongside like Alain Saint-Derin and like the original Trois Gros and all these famous chefs. And he only taught theory. He didn't cook anymore. And he would regale us with stories of these times. And at 18 years old, you don't understand any of it. But I remember, you know, as the bell rang one day and all, you know, the 100 students started shuffling out of the hall to go to lunch or whatever, he was kind of shouting at us an idea that he'd been trying to communicate the entire lesson. And he said, reading is the single best way to advance in this industry. And even though it was a bit too raucous in the room to like for anyone to ask questions after that, but I'm pretty sure he was talking about cookbooks, but he didn't specify. And to be honest, just I think back to that a lot, and I'm like, maybe I took him at face value. And I read a lot of cookbooks, don't get me wrong, but I just read a lot. And I think that exposing yourself to other ideas outside of your domain is a great way to expand your field of possibility within your domain. Like when you start making connections that go beyond whatever it might be, if you're a race car driver, if you are a doctor, if you are a mycologist, if you are a painter, when you start reading about how things fit together in the world at large, you start seeing connections and analogies in whatever it is you do. And I think it is absolutely advantageous to see the patterns in nature and then apply them to your field. If you're a 20-year-old intern, if you've been in your job for 25 years, whatever it might be, it's never too late to learn about how things work.
Very wise words. Very true. Like the true Renaissance men of the, you know, Leonardo da Vinci's of the world, who had this understanding of kind of a bit of everything and joining it all up. David, it's been an absolute pleasure. I could chat to you for hours, but I'm going to have to wrap up the show there.
Yeah, fair enough.
It's been really, really insightful.
It's been lovely chatting with you, Charlie, really. I also kind of wish I got to learn more about your world. And I know you're a podcast host and you're here to ask me questions, but I can see the gears turning in your own head.
Great analogy.
And I'd love to kind of understand which ones are turning. But thank you for the lovely chat. Great questions and great getting to speak to you today.
Thank you again, really. Well, everyone, I hope you've enjoyed today's show. I've got to say a big thank you again to David Zilber. You can follow him if you want to learn more about the work he does on Instagram at David_Zilber. He's challenged the way that I think about food, and I'm sure he will have done for a lot of you as well. I look forward to welcoming you all back for another episode of Game Changer coming up soon. So stay tuned, and I'll see you all very soon.